The message this morning is entitled The Spiritual Discipline of Resist. So the concept of peace is at the heart of most world religions. Christianity tells us blessed are the peacemakers. The Muslim greeting Assalamu alaikum literally means peace be with you. In Judaism, the Hebrew word for peace is shalom, which is derived from one of the names of God. And one of the purposes of the four tenets of Buddhism is to find peace. If there is one defining characteristic of all religions, it's probably peace. Peace is sort of the conceptual duct tape that holds all religions together. Now, one of the key ingredients in the pursuit of peace is social justice. The lack of social justice breeds discontent, non-cooperation, conflict, civil unrest, and at its worst, war. And being that peace is the conceptual duct tape that holds religions together, it's not surprising then that social justice is also a major theme of most religions. It's somewhat surprising then that so few individual religious communities spend time talking about social justice, more or less actually getting out and doing the work of social justice. See, it's informative to talk to those groups and to point out the centrality of peace and social justice in their belief system, and then ask them why they lack such things in their corporate practices. And frequently the answers are things like, well, we're just unsure of how to do it, or we're just far too busy. Well, interestingly, these are the same responses you get when you ask certain communities about their prayer life, or their meditation life, or their spiritual studies. Knowing how difficult these kinds of things can be for people, and knowing how important they can be to a healthy spiritual development, many religions promote the idea of spiritual disciplines. Now, whether it is prayer or study or meditation or any number of things, the concept is to practice these things on a consistent basis in order to both improve our ability to do them and in order to establish their importance in our lives and in our spiritual journeys. There have also been studies that suggest that spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices, have a direct and positive impact on our mental and emotional health. And some, in like the case of yoga, can actually have a direct and positive impact on your physical health as well. Now, putting all of this together, I find it very surprising, somewhat disappointing, that so few religions teach the active pursuit of social justice as a spiritual discipline. As I've noted, many folks who recognize the centrality of social justice in their religion do not spend much time actually doing acts of social justice. And it may be because they truly aren't sure what to do, or maybe they're uncomfortable with what a boots on the ground pursuit of social justice looks like, or any number of things. And that's sort of the beauty of making social justice a spiritual practice. As I said, the concept of spiritual discipline is to practice something on a consistent basis in order to both improve your ability to do them and in order to establish their importance in your life and your spiritual journey. It seems to me that is exactly the answer to some of the hesitation that folks have with doing the work of social justice. few years ago, I wrote an article that approached this idea of resistance as a spiritual discipline from a more political point of view. But at its heart was the concept of making social justice a spiritual practice. I have to say, it seems to be a concept that has a lot of interest. Within the first 24 hours, that article had more than 22,000 social media shares. And while that's certainly not a scientific measurement, it does seem to suggest that people are exceptionally interested in it as an idea. In the article, I said, I believe that we must start seeing resistance as a spiritual practice. It must be a daily discipline. It is our spiritual responsibility to stay informed. It is our faithful duty to stay vigilant. It is our moral obligation to make our voices heard and to share with those in need the access that our places of privilege grants. You see, when Jesus was confronting the Sadducees and Pharisees, he wasn't just confronting religious leaders. They were also representatives of the government. Jesus wasn't crucified because he was some super awesome guy that quietly went about asking people to please just be nice to each other. Jesus was crucified because the Roman authorities of the day saw him as a real threat to the state, a threat to political order, and most importantly, a threat to those in power. He was a threat because he directly and at times disruptively confronted the powers that be when they took advantage of their power at the expense of the least of these. Just as the cleansing of the temple story shows us, this was particularly true when people used religion to do so. There are those who will try to argue that Jesus was not political. Well, ironically, they frequently are the very same people who want a Christian nation, their personal brand of Christianity, of course. The biblical reality, however, is that it is laughable. It is laughable to say that Jesus wasn't political. If you call yourself a Christian or at least place a value on the teachings of Jesus, you have no other option but to confront a morally corrupt government. We must stand up not only for our own rights and interests, but for the rights and interests of others. We must promote equality, justice, and love in our every action, but not fall victim to the false perspective that to do so means we must do so timidly and with trepidation. From immigrants' rights to the reproductive rights of women, we must come together and insist that our voices be heard at all costs, because the cost of doing nothing is unthinkable. Resistance must become a spiritual discipline. How do we make it a spiritual discipline? Well, start by doing something about it every day. Here's just a short list of things you can put into practice on a daily basis. Contact your representatives. Let them know your position on current issues and encourage them to support their constituents rather than big business and big oil. Speak out publicly on issues of justice. Blog or write op-eds for local papers, or make social media posts promoting better ways forward and encouraging others to join in making resistance a daily practice. Volunteer locally, and particularly at agencies that may have had their funding cut under certain administrations. Do not become complacent in the face of alternative facts. Counter them actively. Share resources. And beware of where you get your news. Focus on reliable news sources. And as much as possible, avoid the lazy approach of littering your presentation of your position with name calling. In doing so, you're only appealing to those who already agree with you and distracting those who might have been convinced otherwise. Contribute to organizations and even individuals who are working to aid the resistance, as well as organizations like PBS and NPR who may be losing their funding. Attend every march and demonstration that you can. And the last on my list, not a complete list by any means, is promote and lift up those who are putting themselves, their careers, and quite possibly their personal welfare on the line for the sake of stopping draconian legislature and executive orders. Resistance must become a spiritual discipline. Just repeat that to yourself on a daily basis. Resistance must become a spiritual discipline. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King made social justice a spiritual discipline of his life. And as a result of the Montgomery bus boycott, which was a political and social protest, eventually it led to the Supreme Court ruling that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. The dream that he told us about on the March on Washington was firmly rooted in his spiritual pursuit of social justice. And we all know well the achievements of Dr. King. Let us not, however, forget that he reached those goals not only with the underpinning of his own consistent practice of social justice, but with the massive support of people like you and me who are willing to make social justice in the world a daily personal pursuit as well. The pursuit of social justice must become a spiritual discipline. Social justice as a spiritual discipline seems to have been a part of many lives of those who have most successfully worked towards equality and the rights of individuals. From Gandhi's Salt March to Dorothea Dix's constant lobbying on behalf of the mentally ill, social justice and social practice has been at the core of many of our most important advances in human rights. Holocaust or Shoah survivor, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and author Elie Wiesel tells us, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And he also tells us sometimes we must interfere when human lives are in danger, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Whenever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. And one more quote from Elie Wiesel. There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. So I conclude repeating, social justice must become a spiritual discipline. We must stand up not only for our own rights and interests, but for the rights and interests of others. We must promote equality, justice, and love in our every action, but not fall victim to the false perspective that to do so means to do so timidly or with trepidation. From immigrants' rights to reproductive rights of women, we must come together and insist that our voices be heard at all costs, because the cost of not doing so is unthinkable.